welcome to Budget MTG Decks. All magic fun, all cards under $1. I'm David, and today we're going to learn how to play our first turns of a Magic game. Now Magic is quite a complicated game, so we won't be looking at all the rules, just the bare basics so we can play our first couple of turns. We may even be leaving a couple of rules out, just for simplicity's sake. Okay, well, a turn is divided into 5 steps. The beginning, the main phase, the combat phase, the second main phase, and the end of the turn. Let's start at the beginning of our first turn. The phase is divided into 2 steps, the untap step and the draw step. First we're going to untap all our permanents. Permanents are basically cards that stay on the table, such as lands and creatures. As we don't have any, we move straight onto the draw step. Drawing is just taking the card from the top of the library. However, we're not going to do that right now because the first player of a Magic game skips his or her first draw step. So as we went first, we're going to skip this. In subsequent turns, we will be drawing a card at this point of the game. Okay, so let's have a look at the next phase of the game, which is the first main phase. The first main phase is the part of the game where we can play a land and we can cast our spells. If we look at our hand, we see we have 4 planes, which are lands, and 3 creature spells. First, we will play a land for this turn. It is important to remember that we can only play 1 land per turn, even if we have more in our hand. Next, we may play spells, as discussed in our previous video. Since we now have a plains on the battlefield, we have access to 1 white mana. Of the 3 creatures we have, only 1 creature costs 1 white mana to cast, and that is our Sanctuary Cat. All we have to do is tap our plains, and we can move the Sanctuary Cat card from our hand onto the battlefield. And we have to remember that there is no limit to the amount of spells we can cast in our turn. However, we are limited by how much mana we have available. As we don't have any more mana to cast spells, we're going to move on to our combat phase. After the combat phase begins, we get to declare attackers. We now decide which one of our creatures will attack our opponent. To attack our opponent, we tap our creatures 90 degrees. However, we cannot attack with our Sanctuary Cat. Why not? Well, when a creature first hits the battlefield, it suffers from something called summoning sickness. Basically, it's disoriented and confused from being summoned to the battlefield. Simply put, you cannot attack with creatures you summoned the same turn. This wears off at the beginning of your next turn. As we can't attack, we move on straight to our second main phase. Well, the second main phase is exactly the same as our first main phase. If we didn't play a land in our first main phase, we would be allowed to do so here, and we can also cast spells. As we did play a land, and we don't have any more mana, there's really not much more for us to do right here, so we're going to move on to our ending. To end the turn, we first note that all damage to all creatures wears off. In essence, at the end of each turn, all creatures still alive heal back to their normal toughness. As our Sanctuary Cat didn't take any damage this turn, we don't have to do anything. Finally, if we have more than 7 cards in our hand, we have to discard down to 7. This is because at the end of our turn, we're not allowed to have more than 7 cards in our hand. As we have 5, we don't have to do anything. As it is the end of the turn, we pass the turn on to our opponent. Our opponent draws a card, and during their main phase, plays a land known as a forest. A forest is a type of land which only produces green mana. They don't cast a spell, skip the next turns, and pass the turn on to us. At the beginning of our second turn, we untap our permanents, which is our plains card, and now we get to tap our plains again for mana, should we want to. Then we draw a card and move on to our first main phase. We should note that our Sanctuary Cat now no longer suffers from summoning sickness, and will be able to attack in the next combat phase. Let's move on to our first main phase. First thing we do is we play another land. So now we have 2 lands, 2 plains, so access to 2 white mana. If we look at our hand, we see we have a Glory Seeker creature spell. Glory Seeker has a casting cost of 2 mana, 1 of any color, and 1 white mana. Let's tap both our plains in order to have 2 white mana available, and we can cast Glory Seeker. Very good. Now we can move on to our combat phase. At this point, we can declare our creatures to attack our opponent. Considering that Glory Seeker now has summoning sickness, we can only attack with our Sanctuary Cat. By tapping our Sanctuary Cat, we have declared it as attacking, and our opponent may block it with their creatures should they want to. However, our opponent has no creatures, so Sanctuary Cat deals its power in damage to our opponent, which is 1. Our opponent's life total goes from 20 to 19. We don't have anything to cast in our second main phase, so we end the turn and we pass the turn on to our opponent. Our opponent draws a card, then plays a second forest. Our opponent casts a Runeclaw Bear. This creature spell costs 1 mana of any color to cast and 1 green mana. By tapping both forests, our opponent has access to 2 green mana and can pay the casting cost of the spell. As Runeclaw Bear has Summoning Sickness, it cannot attack, and our opponent skips the remaining phases and passes the turn on to us. This will be our final turn for the sake of this tutorial. We start our turn, we untap our permanents, and we draw a card. Then we play our third Plains land and move on to our combat phase. We may now declare attackers. We declare both our Sanctuary Cat and our Glory Seeker by tapping them. It is important to remember that you can only declare an attack on an opponent, never individual creatures. Now our opponent has a chance to declare any of their creatures to block our creatures. The defending player always decides how creatures block. It is important to note that although Runeclaw Bear does suffer from Summoning Sickness, it may still be used to block. But our opponent has a problem. Each creature can only block one creature, so Runeclaw Bear can either block our Sanctuary Cat or our Glory Seeker, but not both. Our opponent decides to use Runeclaw Bear to block our Sanctuary Cat. Note that blocking does not cause Runeclaw Bear to tap as attacking would. Now let's have a look at how the damage gets resolved. All creatures simultaneously deal their power in damage to each other's toughness. The cat deals 1 damage to the bear deals 2 damage to the cat, and Glory Seeker deals 2 damage to our opponent. The bear's 2 toughness allows it to survive the 1 point of damage. The cat, however, is not so lucky, as the 2 points of damage is sufficient to kill this 2 toughness creature, and it is placed into our graveyard. Finally, our opponent loses 2 life from our Glory Seeker, and we end the combat phase. We also skip our second main phase and go straight to the end of the turn. At this point, Runeclaw Bear heals its 1 point of damage and is back to 2 toughness. Well, now we know the basic turn sequence of a Magic game. I'm David, and this was Budget MTG Decks. Join me next time as we explore the cool abilities that our creatures can have.